Imagine this scene: a room in the White House, nearly 20 of the most powerful oil executives in the world, and a promise that sounds almost cinematic in its ambition. I'm Fareed Zakaria. And what President Donald Trump put on the table was not a policy tweak, it was a wager on power itself. $100 billion. Private money, not government funds, poured into a country where American companies have already lost billions. In exchange, Trump offered something extraordinary: total safety and total security. The logic was simple: rebuild Venezuela's oil industry, flood the market, push prices down to $50 a barrel, and ease pain at the gas pump for you. But beneath that simplicity lies a deeper question. What happens when economic ambition collides with political reality? If you want to understand how energy, sovereignty, and power are being rewired before our eyes, stay with me. Because to grasp this moment, we need to step back and see the problem Trump is really trying to solve. Strip this story to its core, and the real issue comes into focus. This is not just about oil. It is about control over prices, over supply, and ultimately over political outcomes. Venezuela sits on some of the largest oil reserves on earth, yet its energy infrastructure is broken. Its political system is disputed, and for global energy markets, it has become a symbol of wasted potential. Trump's argument to industry leaders was direct. If American companies step in, production rises. If production rises, global prices fall. And if prices fall, American consumers feel relief. But markets do not operate in a vacuum. They rest on contracts, courts, and confidence. And in Venezuela, those foundations are precisely what executives say are missing. That is why the pushback was immediate, not ideological, not emotional, but structural. Oil executives weren't rejecting opportunity. They were rejecting uncertainty, legal, political, and sovereign. And that tension between bold political vision and institutional fragility is where the story truly begins. Because to understand why Venezuela became uninvestable, we have to look backward before we can look ahead. To understand how Venezuela reached this point, you have to see it as a story of cycles, economic and political. For decades, oil was not just Venezuela's export, it was its identity. Revenue flowed in, institutions weakened, dependency deepened. When prices were high, inefficiency was hidden. When prices fell, the system cracked. Foreign companies entered, exited, then re-entered each time, losing more trust, more capital, more patience. Billions were written off, legal frameworks shifted, contracts became fragile, courts lost credibility. By the time executives today look at Venezuela, they are not seeing reserves, they are seeing risk layered upon risk. That is why Exxon's CEO used such a stark word at the White House: uninvestable. Not because oil isn't there, but because rules no longer feel real. Trump's proposal tries to short-circuit that history, to replace institutions with guarantees, to substitute law with power. And that is where the danger and the drama begins. Because when you bypass systems, you create pressure points. And pressure, sooner or later, always finds a release. Then came the moment that crystallized everything. Inside the White House, the language shifted. This was no longer a theoretical discussion about markets or long-term reform. It became a demand for commitment now. $100 billion. Not phased over decades, not contingent on reforms already in place, but premised on a promise of protection. When executives asked the most basic question, what happens if Venezuela collapses again? The answer was blunt. They know the risks. That sentence landed like a shockwave, because in global energy, risk is calculated. It is priced, it is insured. But this was different. This was risk anchored to political will, not legal structure. Trump tried to close the gap with words like total safety and total security, but without mechanisms, those words hovered in the air. If this analysis helps you see how power is being redefined in real time, pause for a moment, share it, or follow for what comes next. Because what looks like confidence on the surface may actually be the first crack. And once a crack forms, the system starts to strain. Next, we need to expose the mechanism hiding beneath the promise. Here is what sits beneath the rhetoric, the mechanism rarely stated out loud. Trump's plan does not rely on Venezuela becoming stable. It assumes instability can be managed externally. The proposal hinges on a simple exchange. Private American capital flows in. Political and security backing flows from Washington. Oil revenues, meanwhile, do not fully return to Venezuelan control. They are routed into accounts overseen by the United States, economic output separated from sovereign authority. This is not market capitalism in its pure form. It is power capitalism, where force, leverage, and control replace institutions. In theory, this bypasses Venezuela's broken systems. In practice, it concentrates risk into a single variable, U.S. dominance. And dominance is not permanent. Administrations change, priorities shift, guarantees expire. For oil companies, this creates a paradox. They are asked to invest as if the system was stable, while being told the system must be overridden. That contradiction is why skepticism persists. Because when law is replaced by power, profitability becomes political. And politics is volatile. Once you see that, the next escalation becomes inevitable. Because when power is stretched this far, something or someone pushes back. Then the second fault line appeared wider and far more dangerous. This was no longer just about Venezuela. At the same meeting, Trump spoke casually about acquiring other nations' territory, Greenland, a self-governing land, part of Denmark, a NATO ally. The message was unmistakable. If the United States does not act, China or Russia will, and America would choose the easy way or the hard way. For energy executives, this changed the calculus instantly, because now the guarantee of security in Venezuela was linked to a broader worldview, one where borders are negotiable and alliances are tools. That worldview has consequences. If territorial norms weaken, so do treaties. If treaties weaken, so does NATO. And if NATO weakens, the global order that stabilized energy markets after World War II begins to fracture. This is the second crisis, not a collapse, but a signal. A signal that economic strategy is being fused with geopolitical coercion, that oil, territory, and security are becoming parts of the same bargaining table. And when those lines blur, uncertainty multiplies. Because investors can hedge against price swings. They cannot hedge against a collapsing order. And that brings the story closer to you. Now, let's bring this down from boardrooms and borders to you. Because when leaders talk about oil at $50 a barrel, what they're really talking about is your life, your commute, your grocery bill, your heating costs, your sense of stability. You are told this plan is for you. That cheaper oil will ease pressure. That bold moves bring relief. But here is the uncomfortable truth. When energy strategy depends on political force rather than trust, volatility doesn't disappear, it shifts. It shows up as sudden shocks, as price spikes, as uncertainty you cannot plan around. You don't get to vote on oil contracts. You don't sit in the White House East Room, but you absorb the consequences when systems wobble. And when private companies hesitate, it's not because they don't care about consumers. It's because they see fragility before it reaches your wallet. If this perspective resonates, if you want to understand how decisions far above your head quietly shape your daily life, stay with me. Share this. Keep watching. Because this story doesn't stop at America's borders. It echoes across the world. Look at this from the outside, and the ripple effects become clear when the United States signals that energy supply can be reshaped through political control. Every major power pays attention. Europe hears uncertainty. China sees opportunity. Russia recognizes a challenge. Venezuela is not just an oil state. It is a test case. If revenue can be redirected, sovereignty bypassed, and production enforced through power, then the rules of the global energy system quietly change. Allies worry about precedent, because if intervention becomes normalized, protection becomes conditional, and conditional protection reshapes alliances. That is why international organizations reacted so sharply, not because of sympathy for Venezuela's leadership, but because the principle at stake is larger than one country. Global energy markets depend on predictability. Shipping lanes, contracts, neutral rules. Once those rules bend, supply chains tighten. Prices stop reflecting demand alone and begin reflecting fear. And fear spreads faster than oil ever could. This is how a proposal meant to lower prices risks doing the opposite, by injecting geopolitical risk into every barrel. And that leads us to the most difficult question of all. What happens next? So let me lay out the futures, not predictions, but paths. The first path is the optimistic one. Political guarantees hold. Oil companies cautiously re-enter. Production rise. Prices ease. Venezuela's output stabilizes under external oversight. In this scenario, power substitutes for institutions temporarily. Markets accept the trade-off. Volatility is contained, but this outcome depends on one fragile assumption: continuity. The same priorities, the same enforcement, the same political will. The second path is the middle one, and far more likely, investment dribbles in, not 100 billion, but a fraction, enough to test the waters, not enough to transform the system. Prices fluctuate, legal uncertainty persists. Risk premiums remain baked into every decision. The system limps forward unstable, unresolved. Then there is the third path. Security guarantees fracture, political winds shift. Control becomes contested, capital freezes, projects stall, markets react violently. In that scenario, Venezuela is not rebuilt, it is weaponized. And the attempt to control oil prices accelerates disorder instead. History tells us something sobering. When power tries to outrun institutions, institutions eventually snap back. And when they do, the cost is never theoretical. One final question remains. How should we understand this moment? This moment tells us something profound about the world we are entering. We are moving from an era where rules restrained power to one where power is being asked to replace rules. Trump's Venezuela pitch is not just an energy proposal. It is a signal that economic outcomes can be engineered through dominance, that sovereignty can be conditional, that markets can be bent if force is strong enough. But history is unforgiving to that logic. Short-term control often creates long-term instability, and instability always finds its way back to ordinary people. The real insight here is not whether Venezuela can produce more oil. It is whether the global system can absorb this kind of strain repeatedly, because once one precedent is set, others follow. If this analysis helped you, see beyond the headline, share it. If you want to understand the forces reshaping power, markets, and your future, stay with me. This story isn't over. It's just beginning. And the next chapter will test whether power can truly replace trust, or whether trust, once broken, is impossible to rebuild.